welcome back in many cases. Welcome back to the School of Architecture, Design and Planning. Welcome those of you who are here for the first time to this evening's discussion, Lloyd Rees and the Architects. And we'll be looking at this wonderful publication. I'm Donald McNeill, I'm the Dean and Head of School, and I think it's really exciting to have a really good reflection on just the role of art in the school and our ongoing interest in it as a form of understanding what we're trying to do in our education. I acknowledge that we're meeting on Gadigal land, acknowledge elders past and present, and reaffirm the growing importance that the school is placing on designing in country, working with community, and really embedding that into our curriculum and practice. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Simon Weir. Simon will be presenting a short lecture followed by a discussion with our esteemed panelists. But pass on to Simon and enjoy the evening.
Thanks, Donald. It's a great privilege and a wondrous thing to be reflecting on Lloyd Rees's contribution to the School of Architecture and the influence that he had on so many Australian architects and the ongoing influence I see of some of the founding principles of the architecture school that he sought to embody and he tried to share, and how much we will see the school has changed in the interim. I'm Simon Weir, as Donald said. I wrote an afterword here reflecting on Lloyd Rees's contribution to the architecture school. From my perspective on that, it's now the second time I've been asked to speak about Lloyd Rees, and the first time was coming up to 2018 on the centenary of the architecture school. And at those times, we were really thinking a lot about Leslie Wilkinson's influence on the school. And for something that many of you might know, but some of you younger people might not, is that I think Lloyd Rees was the last hire that Leslie Wilkinson made before his retirement. And so if we think about Leslie Wilkinson's direct contact being the people that he brought to the school, that lasted all the way from 1918 when he got here to nearly 1988. When Lloyd Rees finally passed away. And it's many of you in the audience here, I think, who are really carrying forward a lot of that tradition, so to speak, or that perspective on how architecture might be thought of in a contemporary world. I mean, Lloyd Rees lived through that enormous transition that Australia went through, and I don't know if anything changed Australia quite so much as the First World War. And the complete change in the architecture industry that brought, and we spent some decades, I think, digesting the reality of something like that. Because it's easy to imagine that in the century since the architecture school was founded, that there's been we've learned collectively a lot about architecture, and so there'd be more to study now than there was back then. But we've also stopped studying some things to make room for these new things, and I think in some of the things that Lloyd was greatest at are some of the things that we sometimes see less of, not only in our architectural education, but in a lot of the architecture that we see that comes from this that form of education. And really before I started getting didactic about the history of architectural education, I do think it's important that we kind of stop and reframe our way of engaging with the world and trying to think about it as visually as we can. So the cover is one of Lloyd's last paintings, or later paintings. This is 1986. He died in 1988. You can see the vision is getting kind of blurry, and that's one of the the 1A way to interpret this. But we're heading towards something resembling like a color field, where we sense something strong about the artist's intention and the way they feel emotively in response to space. Perhaps even better if we try to embrace the entire mood that this is creating. And I'm sure this is, of course, one of the works where you do need to see it in person. The colors that we get on our data projector are not the colors that can be found in an oil painting. They're two different color gamuts, but this is the best kind of approach to get us start thinking about the emotive value of architecture, and perhaps even the aesthetic movement, as Oscar Wilde would have put it, about the value of aesthetics in public architecture in general. But I wanted to start particularly with these, Leslie Wilkinson's original drawings, to show how the process of educating yourself in architecture, which involves copying great works, becomes a process of visually inspecting every last detail of a building. You see both in Wilkinson's drawings and in Lloyd Rees's drawing, every stone, every brick is drawn as a thing. And it's the articulated connections between objects. And when you start to look at things like this and you start to gain mastery over architecture, when you start gaining mastery over visual representation, and you know for a fact, I can draw it the way it looks. Of course, there will be color shifts, and there is the veil of my perception. But I can draw it the way it looks, or I can draw it slightly differently to how it looks. And I can ask myself, do I think it looks better after the variation that I've made rather than before? And this is really just a view of talking about representation in terms of like an apprenticeship and then mastery. And mastery is that point where you say, you know in yourself, I can make it look like it looks, and I'm going to change it on purpose towards some end. Once you have that kind of control, we can start rethinking what these exercises in representation really connect us to designing buildings from where you're going to look at them from. That's the perspective that you design them from. And of course, everybody says that they might do that now, because that is the way buildings work, but it's no longer, I think, foregrounded to the extent that it used to be. We've become much better technical architects, much better planners, perhaps. But this is one of the things that we've spent less time doing. But this is the kind of work that a young Lloyd Rees would have seen around him as what constitutes architectural drawing. And so even though he did not train to be an architect, he drew buildings as they were. And of course, he kept drawing himself, often looking directly at the mirror. And we have one of those beautiful embedded ironies of visual representation, is that if you stare into a mirror, the image of that makes people think you're looking at them. While you look at yourself in representation, you are seen to be looking beyond yourself afterwards, rather than looking away from us. And here's some of the very early examples. Lloyd is in his early 20s at this point, a lot of drawings of architecture. And that impetus, like I said, of these early buildings here, where you visit this site, you will see that this is not exactly the way this building looks. But because we see such mastery in his work and such beautiful aesthetic value, we start to wonder whether or not this is a representation of what the building could have been if the architect had this kind of aesthetic sensibility. And thinking all the time about making the city a more beautiful place. And here a few years later, when Lloyd got the job of drawing some of the parts of Sydney University, we get some beautiful flashbacks of what this used to be like when there was a dirt road and some scrub out the front of the Great Hall, and what at the time was Fisher Library, one of the great works of Walter Liberty Vernon, who's the most famous, one of the most extraordinary architects Australia's ever had, who also did the large parts of Central Station, the Mitchell Library, the Art Gallery of New South Wales, these incredible works of across 1900 before the Great Depression and the war, and all the things that changed the stone industry completely. And that was the world that the graduates of the architecture school first faced, the end of the stone industry. But the greatest works of architecture at the time were works in stone. And then as Lloyd Rees went on, he did what he's now perhaps most famous for, is his extraordinary series of drawings of trees. And that really are, I think, some of the finest works of drafting art that Australia and any Australians ever accomplished. These are absolutely extraordinary works of loving fidelity towards the natural environment that he saw, and yet full of strange, idiosyncratic abstractions where Lloyd really is showing us what he sees in this, not just what it is. And always finding a way to thread that needle between the impression of great verisimilitude to reality, but then again, it's not exactly the aim, which is what Lloyd Rees well knew, as he wrote about quite explicitly. And then in the late 1940s, he joined the architecture school at Leslie Wilkinson's request. And I think it's at that point he began the series of landscape paintings that I think his greatest works, though there aren't that many of them to be seen in public collections. I wish more of them were available to be seen. And this is this series of works that Brett Whiteley rightly had such praise for. His extraordinary ability to take the Australian landscape and to embed it with that particular kind of curvature, which produces a particular aesthetic response in its audience, to show us the beauty of the landscape through a very particular form of deformation, which is also what he was doing, of course, in his architectural works. Take the world and through a particular kind of deformation of reality, produce something that has an aesthetic value that he was really hoping to communicate to people and sharing his love of the landscape. So this is really the key points of Lloyd's life up until the time he spent in the architecture school. And Ross Wilson's fabulous book, which I've been involved in for some time, goes into a lot of detail about his time here and the many architects who reported and had such fond memories of his contribution to their architectural education and the way they see their work today. And Ross Wilson's amazing, so many interviews of people who work with Lloyd Rees to give us some first-hand accounts of the profound transformative effect that Lloyd's vision of the world imbued in people. And so many of these personal experiences, because a lot of you have seen his lectures, I've seen his lectures, the recorded lectures, and they are extraordinary things that we really don't do so much anymore. I often feel like he'd show a painting to the audience and tell them how it made him feel and why. And then he'd show you another image and tell you what parts of it made him feel particular things. So in a way, it was like an art education. But what it also seemed like, when you listen to the sounds of the audience, that it's an education in emotions. It's an education into emotional sensibilities and to talking about your response to the world in these terms, as if he believed that was important for the art of architecture, for the architects to have some sensitivity to such things. Because, there are people in the world who are sensitive to such things. And when you're doing public architecture especially, it's important to be able to communicate to aesthetically sensitive people things that are particular to them. And that is, I think, one of the things that, if you don't spend some time training yourself in the relationship between visual experience and aesthetic experience, then you can't make beautiful architecture on purpose. And it's one of the things that it's worth knowing how to do, so that if you want to do it, you know what to do, rather than saying, well, I like the idea of making a beautiful building, but I've never tried. My building can stand up, it can resist the sun, function is good, but never got around to that, And Vitruvius just gave 3 key parts to architecture, and that was one of them. And it's something that, one way or the other, we can't do without. And so with this, heartfelt advocacy for remembering this key part of the Vitruvian triad, I'd like to invite our fantastic speakers to ask some questions about your experience with Lloyd Rees. So we have Ross Wilson, the author of the book. We have Andrew Anderson, and Chris Johnson. If you'd join us on stage, make them feel welcome, please. Thanks so much for joining us, guys. I'd like to start with you, Ross, since you are, after all, the author. Let's just start with the obvious question. Like, I have my my sense of like what I personally have learned from Lloyd Rees and what I've learned about Lloyd Rees' influence on architecture by reading your book multiple times. But why did you write it? What did you learn about Lloyd by writing this book?
I think this book came a little bit by happenstance, or things in my life which connected in the end. When I was growing up as a kid, my grandparents lived in Horan Street, St Lucia, and at the end of this street was this house that my father, who was an architect, said that Lloyd Rees spent his childhood in. And this house was getting shabbier and shabbier by the year, and one year it wasn't there. Now in Brisbane, that means one of two things. Once it's been towed away, or it's been demolished. But it always intrigued me, just looking at this house that was, I don't think anyone was living there, about the lives that were lived within it. The other thing was, I come from a family of architects. My brother, my father, my grandfather, and my great-grandfather. And my mother was a landscape architect. So, as you're driving around Brisbane, of course, you learn to see things through an architect's eyes a little bit. And Brisbane, because it's so hilly and so curvy, it's all, the exciting thing is the approach of buildings and going around them and seeing them from that perspective. And my father and mother would always talk about the history of buildings, what they're made, their orientation. So I did have a little bit of an interest in an architect, but the real thing that convinced me to do the book was, well, Matthew Wengert, the publisher, had done some research and found that Lloyd was this remarkable teacher, which I didn't know about, and he told me that the remarkable thing about Lloyd was that nearly everyone he spoke to had extraordinary memories and vivid memories, and the thought that he was contributed a lot to their professional and artistic lives. And I thought that's I'm always very interested in teachers, and Matthew had begun the research on this book and handed that over to me. But the thing that sold it to me was I'd read Peaks and Valleys many years before, just out of interest, before it ever arose that there might be a book. And Lloyd was in this book, he would discuss spiritual aspects of his life. I mean, things that blew me away, like he was just going to Ironside State School, which I know in Brisbane, from down the road from my grandparents, and this sort of sense of unease he had about how he fitted into time and how he fitted into the world and all of those kind of things. His obsession with churches as sort of beacons to the past, where encoded with all sorts of meaning about the society we live in, even though he couldn't make the leap to faith himself and couldn't, the strictures of organised religion were not for him. He was obsessed about the architecture of it. And in his books, it was this element, more than anything else, that grabbed me and really wanted me to try and understand the person who had painted these things and what was in the paintings. I'm obsessed a little bit by a quotation from the beginning of a Patrick White book, and it's, there is another world, but it is within this one. And, Lloyd just sort of embodied that he could paint the world that we see and find another world into it. So as soon as Matthew gave me the research, as soon as I started speaking to all his former students, many of whom are in the room, I knew that there was a story in it. I was helped enormously by the Rees family, who are beyond generous, and saw me through many drafts where I didn't really know what I was talking about enough, and pushing me to understand more. So yeah, that's why I became deeply involved in this book and wanting to know more about Lloyd.
We have two of Lloyd's former students, Andrew and Chris. Can I have before we go to them, a quick show of hands? How many people in this room were taught by Lloyd? Yeah, almost half. Excellent. So, Chris, could you share some of your memories of Lloyd and the...
Look, it's Lloyd got into me a way of seeing things. In fact, I remember him saying, if you get the bus into town, don't sit there reading a book. You must look out the window, see what is happening around you. We did art classes with him. He would give lectures, but he would also take us out into the field. And that's where it was most enjoyable. We'd have a kind of bit of plywood, I think about this size, and a bit of paper clipped onto it. And I remember going up to Redfern Station and looking at that beautiful sweep of the rail lines as it goes past the buildings there, and sort of scribbling away, trying to get something to happen. And Lloyd, I recall, came up behind me and said, no, sweep, get the feel of this. And I think a lot of us as early people drawing are very tentative to sort of try to get it right, to get the straight lines, to do these things. And he said, no, look, just get the feel of it and smudge it, move it, and just try to create things. And in fact, I've still got that drawing. It's black ink, and it sort of manages to kind of get that feeling, I think, of a sweep of the railway line as it moves past the station. Another time I recall, we went down to the Paddy's Market areas, where there were still fruit markets and everything, and there were signs all over the place, and I've also got drawings left over from then, where we went round with him looking at the energy that came out of that whole area. Another I recall was down to the Walsh Bay Wharves, where in those days, I now live down there, it's gentrified somewhat, but in those days there were lots of ships with incredible masts and bales of hay, and not hay, but wool being loaded on and off and things, and incredibly dynamic. And again, that was an amazing experience to just see those sort of events and places. So that really stuck very much in my mind as a way to observe, a way to see, and a way to record. And since then, whenever I travel, I take a sketchbook and I do lots of drawings and add colour and do all sorts of things that have all come out of that early experience with Lloyd.
That's interesting. I like the way you describe him, as if he showed you things that were outside the window.
I think so. It's a matter, I think he tried to get to the essence of something, and that's what the cover of the book is a bit about as well, the essence of something, rather than the minute detail of trying to get to it. And a lot of architects, of course, do love minute detail, and we love to draw straight lines and things like this, and that's fabulous to do all of that. But he certainly encouraged us to see in a more holistic way, I suspect, as seeing what we actually saw. And I think also one thing I picked up out of it was quick drawing's almost better than slow drawing. I know that's not necessarily, and certainly when he, in the 1935 area and things, when he was doing those incredible pencil drawings that almost looked like watercolours, it was not slow at all. It was very deliberate and careful. But for people like me, it was to encourage a quickness to draw. And when I travel, of course, I can't sit down for long periods of time, so I do very quick drawings and then add a bit of paint so to give a bit of feel to it.
Excellent. Andrew, thanks so much for joining us today. I'd like to hear your memories of Lloyd, and particularly perhaps how... There you go.
Good. Well, I echo Chris's memories about the pleasures of going out drawing Sydney, and it engendered a real love of the environment, I think, in students of that era. We spent so much time around Sydney Harbour, many of the same places that Lloyd drew, those wonderful fig trees, rock shelves and so on, but also the working port, which has now vanished, all that sort of grungy side of Sydney that's gone. And I think it really engendered a love of the environment and the feeling that, you know, buildings should enhance the environment. They should reflect the environment. They should, you know, be in character with the environment, if you like. I think a lot of that's gone. But there's another side of Lloyd which I found particularly gratifying. Lloyd was a kind of eyewitness to the emergence of modernism in contemporary art. He was around when post-impressionism was the big thing, the Fauves arrived, and you had cubism, abstraction. And he could talk about all of this as if it was still happening, kind of eyewitness all these things. And you know, his art history lectures, they're perhaps not academically, you know, so precise, perhaps not a whole lot of, you know, primary evidence and all that sort of thing, but through his eyes, you kind of relived that very exciting period in the emergence of contemporary art. And the thing about it is there was a lot of drawing going on at Sydney University in those days. I mean, Chris mentions, you know, the pleasure of the freedom of what Lloyd inspired us to do. We had a year of grinding down stick ink, you know, and doing classical compositions and stretching Watman's watercolour paper onto board, and not to mention Miss Finley and the solid 3D geometry and the casting of shadows and constructing ionic volutes, and which I had to help Penelope Seidler with because Harry refused to help her with the volute. He said it was truly decadent, you know. So I mean, there was a lot of drawing, but it was all quite differentiated in many ways. You know, Lloyd's art class was completely different to, you know, sitting with Warren Selly or Miss Finley doing all these traditional geometric exercises and so on, which in hindsight I actually now see as quite valuable. I'm glad I can cast shadows on incised Roman lettering and stuff like that, you know? So makes me feel quite special. Yeah. So Lloyd was also a terrific link to Sydney in the interwar period. You know, we take things for granted about the art scene, but in fact it was pretty lively when you hear Lloyd talk about, you know, scandals with Norman Lindsay and stuff like that, you know, which we all thought a bit feeble, you know, we'd gone beyond all of that. But you realise when you, and Lloyd was very much involved. I mean, we did actually have some lecturers like Arthur Baldwinson, for instance, who'd been involved in the emergence of modernism in the late 30s in Sydney, his wonderful ACI building when he worked for Stevenson and Turner and so on. So there were very interesting things around, and Lloyd was also a kind of bridge to that period of Australian history. Lloyd wasn't alone. I mean, his at least when I did the art classes with him, he had Roland Wakelin, a very fine painter in attendance, a fabulous colourist, and John Santry, who famously did the Chesty Bond ads, but he actually is a very fine portraitist. There are portraits of Lloyd by John Santry, and I remember there would be an Arthur Murch painting hanging around the art studio. And in fact, Lloyd would leave some of his wonderful pencil drawings hanging around, you know, to inspire the students. A bit of a risk, I would have thought, leaving objects like around. So it was a very multifaceted experience. You know, Lloyd could tell you how to rescue a drawing, you know, that had gone all wrong. He said, oh, if you just put a bit of line on the edge here, it'll all come together again. You know, he was very pragmatic. You know? And I think there's a little quote from me saying, don't worry, you know, that 90% of it's not so good. This little 10% of the drawing's wonderful. Get the rest to look like that, you'll be okay. You know?
Yeah, I find it's really interesting reading about Lloyd's approach to art, particularly once he became, you know, interviewed more frequently in his later years, and his resolution that art should be about the eternal things rather than the changing things, and that made him, you know, not a good fit for an era of a lot of politically oriented art and statement art and things that are going on in the 60s and the 70s. I wonder, Chris, do you have any thoughts particularly about that period of the change in art that so many people went through?
Well, I want to swing it to something slightly differently, and that is that the Art Gallery of New South Wales has an incredible collection of all his sketches. Sketchbooks, Ross, you've probably seen them all and things, and their book's been put out about the sketches when he's been travelling through Europe and travelling through other parts of the world. And that's something that I really responded to, that as well as his finished artworks, Lloyd loved to travel and sketch. And he loved Europe particularly, and went to lots of places. So on some of my more recent trips with my wife Davina here, we deliberately went to a hotel that Lloyd used to stay at. I think it's Sal Bengiorno in San Gimignano. He stayed there 5 times up to 1973. But he, in one of the diaries, it says all about the sketches that he always asked for the room that opens onto the terrace, which is a fabulous thing. So we did the same. We bought the room that opened onto the terrace and spent a couple of days in this amazing town of San Gimignano with all its incredible towers, but went out on the terrace, got my trusty little sketchbook and started not quite simulating what Lloyd had done, but feeling the essence of what he'd done. And I recall his views. He did many views from San Gimignano after 5 trips, and sometimes he stayed there a whole month in that hotel. And you could see a particular outline of poplar trees and roofs and a little village that keeps cropping up on them, which I spotted immediately from the terrace. And you could sort of feel very much connected to his excitement. But then you almost swing back the other way from that view and see those incredible towers of the town itself, and which he also, of course, spent quite a lot of time drawing and recording. So I felt a real interest in following some of the places that he went to and some of the places that he seemed to really like. And I think that sketchbook approach, a lot of architects have picked up on. And David Holm, for instance, does an incredible number of drawings, and Philip does, I'm sure, a lot of drawings and things as well of his fabulous artworks, and Rick as well, that it's just a way of seeing and recording, which I think is part of what Lloyd was talking about in his way of teaching us to see and record, and not record as a photograph would, which is quite different when you're actually drawing, because you're actually looking at the profile of those trees and the roofs and all sorts of details while you're trying to draw. So it's a matter of how you see the world, and Lloyd seemed to be very interested in those sort of issues. And reading the text in the diaries by both him and by his wife Marjorie, she says, "Oh, Lloyd had a beautiful day today. It was sunny, and he went out into the fields and he just took his drawing and just spent most of the day doing drawings across the fields and looking back at the town of San Gimignano or other places that he stayed at and things." And I think a lot of architects have a love of travel, to see places, and but to record it not just in a photograph, but in sketchbooks and things, as he did, is, I think, a fabulous sort of thing to do.
Say he also changed something about you're talking a lot about his how he influenced the way you see the world, and kind of the vocation of drawing what you see as a way of visually enjoying it and engaging with it. Did it also affect your approach to architecture?
I think it does, because his approach to drawing is very much about place. It's not just an object in most of them. It's very much how the towns, the trees, the buildings fit into places, etc. And I think that's a really important issue in Australian architecture, is that relationship to landscape and to areas. A lot of my early buildings were school buildings, which were in very nice rural settings and things, and the way those sort of buildings related to their sense of place and landscape, I'm sure, comes out of some of those issues that Lloyd was very much involved in.
Andrew?
Yeah, yes, I agree. It's about creating a sense of place in architecture, and Lloyd made us hugely aware of it. I also went to San Gimignano, didn't stay in the same hotel though. But I went on my grand tour in 1965. I think a lot of the places I visited were places that Lloyd had talked about. It just seemed like a natural response to go and see these things, and they were all wonderful places. You know, he had a very good eye for places like, you know, Chartres Cathedral. He did those extraordinary drawings of, and so on. So yes, I think he did make you think differently about architecture. It wasn't just a kind of simplistic formal thing, but it was about how do you create a genuine sense of place that really has some, you know, emotional impact on people and so on. And I think that's a great failing in architecture today. You get lots of, I mean, you see endless computer-generated perspectives, but they rarely show the setting of how they fit into the place. Does the architecture really respond to the place? So I think it's a huge failing, and probably says something about architectural education today. I don't really know. I mean, I don't know how architecture's taught, so I should shut up. But
And Ross?
Lloyd could so vividly talk about something that Robert Hughes thought that Lloyd had visited it and wanted to go and see it again, and Lloyd had never been there. In the book, there's a description about a bridge that was just like a single line that went through the air, and Robert Hughes sort of said, in his Robert Hughes way, he was itching like a teenager at a pornographic movie to get to Italy. Robert Hughes, it's one of the very interesting things in the book, I thought, was they had an exhibition almost on the same day. It opened on the same day. And Robert Hughes was doing stuff that was much more to the zeitgeist. He was doing what he would call he called tits and bums abstracts and things like that. He wasn't very kind about his own work later on. He thought it was rubbish, actually. And he got the great reviews, and Lloyd was considered by the Herald reviewer on the same day as being, you know, not getting it. Of course, what happened was Robert Hughes's work, he didn't disown, but he destroyed a fair bit of it, as much as he could. And Lloyd's work from that time, he began to understand a lot better as he grew older. And I don't know, there's people here that I know from interviewing them didn't really get Lloyd when he was talking to them. It just took years later for bits and pieces that he'd said along the way to suddenly make sense, and then suddenly they could see something the way through his eyes and understand why he said it. I mean, he was inspired by students and inspired by their energy, but it must have been hard work too. Because, you know, they were enthusiastic, wanting to do things their way, and at times in the university's history, less interested in the line that went all the way back to the pyramids and how it came here. So I'm hoping that maybe Alan Rees might just talk a little bit about what Lloyd's students meant to him, because it was, I think, a very symbiotic relationship.
Do we have a microphone?
Yeah. Here's Alan and Jan up here, and they couldn't have been more helpful with this book.
They come down. Would you mind coming down to the, Ross, could you bring him down to the front? Thanks, Ross. Thanks, good idea. Thanks, Ross.
Yes, no, we just had an introduction to the symbiotic relationship between that and students, something I was going to mention, but in fact you've done so much better than I could.
you. But it was very much a symbiotic relationship. When he was asked, he always said that it was the students who kept him young. The students who had their new ideas, their new approaches, their new questions, all of which required a certain amount of hard thinking if you were going to respond to them with the seriousness with which the questions were asked. And he always said this, just how much the students meant to him. And I thought I'd give you just a little vignette about how much the students meant. And we go back to the second half of 1986. Now, I was at work in Hobart, and in the morning I got a phone call from Dad, and he was very distressed. He said things had developed to the stage where he couldn't cope anymore, and he was extremely worried, and he needed help. So my wife Jane and I were on the plane that afternoon up to Sydney, and things were far worse than we had anticipated. We knew my mother's health had been declining, but it had gone down so much, so rapidly, we could not have contemplated. So there's nothing for it. We had to shift them down to Hobart. Now that was not such a big issue. We had a granny flat attached to the house, and they'd used that for a number of years as a base when they were spending their summer holidays with us in Hobart. So no worries. But the students, and he would not contemplate anything about the mechanics of getting down to Hobart until he had solved the issue of the students. Right. Now, you might have thought that at the age of 91, with a very seriously ill wife, and just about to be picked up and plonked down at a distance of 1,000 kilometres from where the lectures were given, that he might have really thought that times have changed. It was time to quit and simply cancel the rest of the course. Not a bit of it. He wouldn't contemplate even the very basics of moving down to Hobart until he had picked up the phone, got hold of the faculty office, and rearranged his lecture series. So that instead of giving one lecture every Wednesday, he would give 2 lectures every second Wednesday. So every second Tuesday afternoon, he and I would be on the plane up from Hobart. We'd overnight in the family home, catch the ferry into town the next morning and the bus out here to the university. We'd get here about 9:15. He'd get himself a cup of coffee, sit down out there and talk to anyone who had a few minutes to talk to him. And not just talk, but discussions and arguments and analysis. And this would go on until 10 o'clock. Then he'd get up and come in here and lecture from 10 till 11. And I was so glad to be here on the case that he used. And then from after the lecture, another cup of coffee, another hour of discussion and analysis. Anything was fair game, you know, art, architecture, town planning, politics, the world at large, you name it, it was all fair go. And then, of course, he'd lecture from 12 till 1. And then the university, God bless them, would lay on a car and take us out to Mascot. We'd be on the 2:30 plane home. Now, I don't know how many of you are academics here, but you know, just contemplate 2 lectures in a morning. It does put a great strain on you. But there he was. And, you know, I just thought that that was a nice little vignette of the love and respect and even obligation that extraordinary man had for the students in his care at the time. So there.
Alan, can you just say a little bit also about the fabulous waterfall in Martin Place, the Lloyd Rees waterfall?
Yes, I can say it.
Fountain.
The City Council was busy redeveloping Martin Place, and they had this idea for a fountain or a waterfall there. And it was a period of quite high inflation. Prices were going up all over the place, and the council was running out of money, and they had to make some economies. So they decided that they'd drop the idea of a fountain. So Dad wrote to the Herald, and in essence, he said, I ought to do something about it. And the Herald picked this up and ran it as the lead letter. And not only did that, they ran a page 3 article saying that Lloyd Rees had established a committee to raise funds for the fountain, which was the first he'd heard of it. But if the Herald said so, it had to be right. So he formed the committee, and they had a certain amount of difficulty getting money at the beginning because they had a professional money raiser who would make a formal approach. And Dad thought, no, that's not the way to go. So he took over the fundraising and he approached the top dogs in the operation. And I remember someone I used to know who sat on the board of the Commonwealth Bank, and he said, we were faced by this letter from Lloyd Rees asking for money for a fountain. Now, we reckon we need a fountain in Martin Place like we need a hole in the head. But with that signature on the bottom of the letter, okay, we coughed up. But it was slow going, and eventually, well, not quite eventually, but the council got to the stage that they needed some guarantee for funding. And we got this phone call from Dad saying, I hope you don't mind, but Mum and I have agreed. Now, I know Mum had not been consulted. It was the first. Mum and I have agreed to pledge our lifetime savings so we can put the fountain in Martin Place. So there we are. And eventually, they didn't quite raise the amount of money, but they got close enough to it so that the Lord Mayor said, right, the City Council will pick up the rest and you can have your jolly waterfall. And there we have it. And the waterfall was built. And perhaps unfortunately, we were overseas when it was completed and formally opened. But the actual opening, the turning of the key, was performed by our son Jonathan, who's up there in the audience tonight. So,
Brilliant.
does that solve the fountain?
Solves it very well, very well.
Since this is It's Lloyd Rees Appreciation Hour. I also wonder if because I know there's so many people in the audience who have fond memories, if anybody wanted to share their recollections.
Hello. So I was a student of Lloyd's in the 50s, so I'm very old. And I'm finding it very hard to decide which of the many features led me to love and respect him as much as I still do if I think of him. I find just Ross's book made me start smiling again because of the joy he put in our lives. But there are a few things. So, like, I think it was you, Andrew, who said just helping with a particular picture. I remember one time that I'd made a real mess and I was angry with myself, and Lloyd came up and looked at it and, as you said, found a little corner and said, what about a little touch of white? It'll just lift it, and isn't that beautiful? And so you're sort of ready to then go on trying. There's something very personal that I haven't really talked about before, but we lived in Chile for 3 years when there was a military coup, and it was very involving in many, many ways. And when we came back to Australia and were talking about it to people, I realised that for Australians, and all our friends and family, it was just something weird that happens in faraway countries. Lloyd had never experienced directly a war or anything, but he was the one person who just seemed to comprehend immediately what it was about. So what I'm trying to say is that his empathy was at an extraordinary level. And the other thing was the discipline. So you work in the morning, but you're available with your big heart to see people in the afternoon, go and open a primary school art exhibition. And that combination, to me, of how to live has remained with me. Anyhow.
Wonderful, thank you. I wonder if Melody Willis is here? No? Does anybody else want to share their recollections? Thanks so much for sharing. That was a beautiful vignette. You can feel your memory there. No? One down here. Come right back to you. Well, we have a camera problem.
Jean, I was a student in the 70s. I did the art history course in the first year, but then I went every other year, just because I enjoyed the talk so much. But I remember also going to the house and for a barbecue. He took us all for a barbecue out the back and took us down into his studio under the house. I also have the drawing that he came and corrected and said, you can save this drawing by thinking of the shape of the torso. It was a live drawing class. But I also remember seeing this drawing, a painting on the screen. I remember him talking about coming into the harbour and seeing the light and talking about the light in Sydney. And then walking down the street with him in Bridge Street, looking at the Lands Department building and talking about the colour of the stone. And I always think, Andrew probably doesn't know this, but I got to work on one of the first jobs I had in Public Works Department was the Lands Department building. And I always felt it was so special to be working on that building that Lloyd had admired so much. And it's just a lovely privilege to be involved.
Yeah, wow, that's amazing. Thank you.
Yes, look, I'll say something. Dad had a reputation of always finding something positive to say about people's drawings. We've already heard a couple of examples about this, about Redfern Railway Station and about the need for a little bit of white paint dropped in there. And I can tell this story about Penelope Seidler because she told it against herself. And the class was out on the botany lawn drawing the Wilkinson Botany building there, and she was making an utter and absolute dog's breakfast of the whole operation. And she knew it. And she was dreading what Dad would say when he came up to look at what she'd done. And in due course, he did come up to her and he looked at what she'd done. And he considered it very carefully and he thought for a little while. And then he said, "That's very fine painting you're using."
Penelope told me that she can't be here tonight. I think she's overseas, but she told me that she had to pass these subjects, and she went from a person who couldn't draw at all and was all fingers and thumbs to someone who could. I don't think she thought she was the best drawer in the world, but in the time that she spent with Lloyd, she went from zero and never having drawn before or much to someone who could pass an exam, and she credits Lloyd entirely with that. She speaks extremely fondly of him as well.
It is one of those extraordinary things we often hear about, that somebody who kind of transmits that ability to draw and to transform the sheet of paper in alignment with their vision. It's like a memorable event in people's lives. You know, like nobody remembers the first time they learned to boot up an operating system or, learn to use Microsoft Word. No one has a breakthrough moment. You know, but there's something, it does seem to be, from the reports that we get from so many people, something memorably transformative about that event. I think it really connects to something really deep in us. I wonder if you could say more about that.
There was a social side to it too. I mean, this all sounds very serious, but we actually had a lot of fun. I mean, Lloyd would organise a sketching weekend outside Gerringong somewhere, where it looked like the road to Berry, which we all love, and we'd stay the night in the pub, and it was quite boozy. I mean, it was a lot of, he went way beyond the call of duty, if you like, organising things like that. I don't know if lecturers today invite their students for a boozy weekend in the country. It was fun, but we did drawings, and then so it was that side of Lloyd. And I mean, when I was working in London, Lloyd got in touch and we had wonderful lunch together and so on. He kept in touch with students, because as everyone says, he enjoyed the repartee, He liked the students liked him. It was a sort of mutual thing, but certainly rewarding for the students, the ex-students.
Another thing probably people don't understand, that Lloyd's understanding of the classic traditions and things, but when it came to modern architecture, he had a great appreciation of that too, and I think he was talking about your extension to the Art Gallery of New South Wales.
Yes, I took him on a tour of the Art Gallery of New South Wales. It must have been about 1970, just before the building was finished. And he was sort of quite excited by aspects of it. It was a bit risky contrasting the wonderful Vernon building with a piece of modernism in bush-hammered concrete and so on. But Lloyd quite liked some of the gestures, the contrasts, the way the light came in, the way roof lights separated, and he got particularly excited about the vista over Woolloomooloo Bay. That was an important part of the design, to the extent that he actually did a sketch of it and sent it to me. And I thought, well, that's particularly gratifying, that he thought it was good enough to sketch. So I think he did respond to modern architecture in quite a positive way. if it had some qualities, you know, and if it did deal with the environment and the location and all these things.
He also had lifelong relationships with many architects. He saw them as students and then as architects that were just starting out, and then very successful architects. He would meet them at different venues and places like that. And I know that at his funeral in Hobart, 2 architects, Richard Laplustre and John Ansher, I think, were part of those proceedings. So these were lifelong relationships. Something that S.B. Dodds told me that was also very interesting, he really liked Lloyd because when you're a student and you're looking for sort of cracks in the people that are teaching you, some sort of hypocrisy, some sort of thing that doesn't add up, some way that you can get into them. And he absolutely adored Lloyd because he thought he was authentic. Profoundly authentic. He believed everything he said. He was driven by art and architecture. It was a part of his being. It was not something that he could put away. It was something that was part of his persona, something that was part of his every thoughts. I mean, I think Joan told me he used to go to bed dreaming of how he could make the Opera House better, and he couldn't. He was obsessed by he thought that Utzon's solution to the fly tower was magnificent. He just, you know, he thought no one could have done it so well. And then at the end, I don't think they even had a fly tower in that part. But he would dream. As a child, he started off like many architects did, sort of with imaginary cities in sand in Brisbane. He redesigned the great city of Brisbane several times to make it look a bit more like Paris. He wouldn't be the first artist. I think David Malouf as a child did pretty much the same thing. And the book will tell us also that he wanted to become an architect with the great Queensland architect Robin Dodds, who he admired and who did St Bridget's church that you might have just seen there. But his maths weren't up to it. So he went into the world of commercial art, and then from there he took the leap to Sydney, which he fell in love with at first sight, and continued to work in the work of commercial art while doing his own work on the side. And one of the great things about this job that he took at this university was that it gave him set days to work here, but set days to work on his own stuff, and long holidays and sabbaticals to go overseas and to concentrate on the work. So this university, and then he got a lot of his friends to come here, like Ronald Wakelin and stuff, who needed to do the same thing. So there were a whole sort of band of people that were pretty much obsessed with art and artists and art history, who could earn a living by working here, be, you know, sort of charged by the energy that they got from working here, and would also have time to work on their own things. And I think the year that he came here, he painted the road to Berry, and some of his most magnificent paintings were done while he was working here. And that mixture of the two seemed to be very, very productive.
You mentioned the cracks visible in some of the architectural academics. We had the perfect example. We had Professor Ashworth giving us the most portentous history of architecture. It was, I think he was reading from Bannister Fletcher, you know, and that was it, you know, and such a contrast to Lloyd talking about art history, which was a incredible, you know, emotive experience. The two couldn't have been more different. Yeah.
Just wondering why he seemed to change his own drawing from architecture to landscapes around about the time that he joined the architecture faculty.
Oh no, our landscapes were always, but they were very interesting.
But did he do much of architecture after he joined the architecture faculty?
Yes, on his travels, I believe so, and the great pictures of cathedrals and places like that. Yes,
Okay.
but when he did sort of his landscapes in Brisbane, they often would be of like quarries and stuff like that. Had incredible sort of forms to them, and they also were about well, this might be just my obsession, but he was very interested in time and things from the past and ancient things, and their connection to where we are now. So yeah, his stuff from Brisbane, Albion Quarry was one of his early sketches, and they were in a way unlikely things because they weren't beautiful things, but they were dynamic and exciting things to draw, and they had this dimension about time with them. Yeah.
I think that the drawings are actually very architectural. I mean, the trees, the rocks, they kind of oscillate between being anthropomorphic, you can see people in them somehow, but they're also very monumental, like buildings, and I don't think he ever lost that. But I suspect with age, doing those very fine pencil drawings simply became too tedious, and you can see how his paintings become progressively looser. The kind of landscapes in Italy a lot looser than the earlier things. Then Chartres Cathedral, it's looser again. It's all about light. And then the final drawing, the final paintings, the opera house scenes and so on, they're kind of, is it Monet towards the end of his life? What is it? It's all about light, but it's quite wonderful. But I think that evolution is actually quite natural when you think about how a person ages and how digital dexterity declines and so on.
I was wondering whether Peter Todd, you wouldn't mind having a quick. Peter was one of the last students that Lloyd taught, and Richard Laplastria organised this thing for him to design a gallery to hang Lloyd's paintings, which were in the McRae room or something like that. They weren't beautifully, and just about Lloyd's visiting of the project and how that all worked for you, Peter. And your descriptions are in the book, but they're fantastic.
Is this? Yeah. No, look, we had a marvellous design session with Lloyd and Rick, and I. Oh, better. One of the things that struck me was that there were certain things that Lloyd obviously did with his students early on, which he couldn't. His involvement was such that he couldn't pass on to us, and Richard picked up on that, and I can remember freehand drawing and being told to straighten my arm, or let my arm go loose, and do the flowing lines, and all these these things that Lloyd had obviously passed to Richard were passed on to us. So it was a particularly wonderful session, a sort of a swan song session, I thought, and I felt very privileged to have been part of it. And Lloyd, he would, as I said to Ross many times, he sort of suddenly explode with his blue eyes and engage with whatever you were doing, and give such a positive energy to everybody's ideas, and there weren't any failures in that group, as I recall, which is all we all went on to enjoy the benefits. Thanks to Rick and Lloyd. Thank you.
What time do we finish? Simon? Rick? We'll get you a microphone, Rick. Give me a second. Can you just pause for 2 seconds? Can you turn the camera around again? Just pause. Give me a sec. Give him a second.
Could the lady in green be much Sorry,
So that was a really wonderful time we spent with that group of students, because the University of Sydney, I've never been enamoured of their sense of responsibility that they had for playroom over there in the old Gothic section of the quadrangle. But you know, like it's a sandstone building and it's getting on and it's damp and so on and so on. And Lloyd knew that. And I asked him if he'd come and speak with the students about, you know, the wonders of the Gothic tradition and the structure and so forth. And he, of course, immediately said yes. And I picked him up in my little Volkswagen and drove him to the quadrangle. And we got out of the car and we walked into the quadrangle and Lloyd said to me, oh, he said, I hope we're not going to be talking in the playroom. And I knew that we were. I said, no, Lloyd, I'm afraid the bat's in the fire. We're in there. And in we went, and the students were a great group of students. They're still great friends with my family and I. And I could see Lloyd was visibly upset by seeing his paintings in this room. And then he saw the faces of the students all sort of looking up, waiting for him. And he just turned his feelings off for the room and the place. And he gave those students the most brilliant talk on the power of Gothic architecture and Chartres in particular. It was absolutely stunning, and we will never forget that. And we walked out afterwards, just Lloyd and I, back through the quadrangle. I said, Lloyd, how did you manage to do that? He said, oh, he said, it's not so difficult really. He said, if you're going to give a talk on something, he said, the first thing is you've got to find a thread. And this thread you follow through, and then you can go off in different directions and come back to the thread, and then things will finish. And had a good finish to it. He said, it's really not so difficult at all. So, great lesson for those of us who have difficulties in public speaking. And then one more amongst many instances where he said things that have stayed with me and with friends for a lifetime. When he was getting on a bit and his eyesight, Alan and Jan were starting to go, and Marjorie was still with him at the house in Northridge, in Lane Cove there. My friend Pete Sastre and I would go out there and give him a hand with stuff, you know, that he couldn't do, like filing away his paintings and stuff like that, and all down in his little studio room underneath with a big glass window and most of the room taken up by the billiard table, right, and the cricket bat, because you couldn't use a billiard cue in there, only the cricket bat. So Stutch and I would work with him there, and then we'd go and have a cup of tea up there in the dining room, that beautiful dining room, Alan and Jan, that faced on the northeast corner of that house, and the sun would come into that room, which was painted a very soft yellow gold colour in the walls, and brilliant orange yellow curtains, so the sun hit the curtains and flooded the walls, super saturated the colour. And we were sitting around the table and we were talking about the original Australians and length of time here. And we said, oh, Lord, yes, such an amazing sort of understanding. He said, yes, he said, but we shouldn't forget one thing. He said, they have been here a long time, but we should never lose sight of the fact that it was this land that made them that way in the first place. And it shook us both that a painter with a brilliant intellect in his own way was just able to jump back all those years and see just how important the issues of the land are to our present culture and to the future of this amazing country which we are very privileged to live in.
to make a concluding remark?
Well, thank you everyone for coming. Is there anyone else like to speak? It's been a long journey. From when Matthew commissioned the book and Matthew did the original research to the first trips that I made down to see Alan and Jan in Hobart. All I can say is their generosity made the book possible. It's, you know, I'm looking into their lives, and it's always an inadequate task trying to write someone down and see them. And it's a humbling experience always, because you don't know them like the family knew them, and you don't know them from all sides and things. So I was very pleased that they spent hours reading drafts, discussing drafts, letting me know where I was going in wrong directions, giving me new information that would help me with a new idea. I would really like just to thank them and to applaud them before we...
So thanks so much, everybody. It's been a great honour to have heard your perspectives and to momentarily, for those of us who didn't meet him, to kind of bring to life what it has been called, like what Brett Whiteley called him, one of our first masters. And you get that sense from the way people talk about him, that they encountered something which gave them some sense of insight, even if it's into the things that are right in front of us all the time. And like that is what a great transformative educational experience is. And sometimes that can only happen in a moment with the right people. And I know a lot of you in this room are also those kinds of people. And I thank you all so much for coming tonight. And we'll all head out into the atrium behind us here and have a drink and a chat. And
Can we also please thank Ross for actually doing the work?
Thank you, Ross Wilson, exactly.